Hello and welcome to this course on how to master sales qualification. My name is David Craig White and I'll be your instructor for today. For those of you who don't know me, like I said, my name is David Craig White. I'm a sales trainer and startup consultant, and I teach people how to sell their products and services and make more money. For the past 25 years, I've been working as a salesman and a solopreneur. I've worked in B2B sales, working with software sales for around about 18 years. I've closed more than 7 million in new business sales revenue as an individual contributor. I've helped multiple startups raise more than 40 million in funding rounds. And I've trained more than 5,000 people in over 120 countries. I've also made mistakes. I've been declared personally bankrupt. I've been fired before. I've started companies what haven't worked out and I've had to shut them down. So I am human, and it's these mistakes what I would of course love to help you avoid, whilst at the same time of course sharing with you everything what I believe has made me a success during my sales career. So who's this course for? This course quite simply is for salespeople of all levels, freelancers, founders, small business owners, anybody running their own business, or salespeople who want to get better at qualifying buyers. The objective of the course is for you to be able to confidently qualify which buyers have a real need for your solution, so you can eliminate the time wasters and you can build stronger pipelines. So the big focus, what you'll notice throughout this course, is that I'll be very focused on qualifying out to make sure your time is used on the best possible buyers for your products and services. So here's the agenda for the course. I'll start off by talking about why good qualification matters. Then I'll share with you my 10 golden rules for effective questioning. Then we'll dig into how to control conversations, and you will notice that will be a theme throughout the course. We'll do a short exercise on buyer qualification criteria, and then we'll dig into the real detail. I'll take you through some real strategic questioning techniques, what you can use to really qualify if a buyer has a need for your solution. And we'll get closer to the end, and then we'll start to cover effective closing techniques. So I'll share with you a couple of techniques which will help you close at the end of a dialogue with somebody, whether that's a meeting or whether that's an actual sale. I'll give you a couple of closing techniques, and then we'll wrap up by talking about how to qualify budgets, how to qualify decisions and stakeholders and timelines. Okay, this is a heavy course today. We're going to cover a lot. There's a couple of breakout sessions where I'll give you some exercises so you can have a little break there. I think in total, it's going to take around about 60 minutes, give or take. So let's jump in. So why good qualification matters? It matters a lot. But of course, it's always important to explain to you why it matters so you understand exactly why you should be focused on it in the first place. And I'll do that by talking about, first of all, the impact of poor questions, and then I'll cover the impact of poor qualifying. So I've listed here 4 of the major impacts of poor questions. So when you don't have good questioning techniques, so you don't have good questions prepared for your qualification calls, then here's the top 4 impacts I would say what that has. The first one is it's going to result in really awkward conversations sometimes, especially if it's the very start of a conversation what you're having with a buyer. If you don't ask the right questions in the beginning, it really impacts those first sort of 30 to 60 seconds of a conversation, which ultimately is going to result in lost rapport. So awkward conversations, naturally, you want to avoid anywhere in life. The next is that it will make you appear salesy if you start asking questions which ultimately, if you don't practice what questions to ask, you end up asking really salesy questions. And when you do that, what you will lose there is trust with your buyers. So we want to avoid sounding salesy as much as possible. So that's what we'll focus on today for sure. The next thing, and again, I talked about how important and how much focus we'll have today on control of conversations. If you don't ask good questions, you won't be able to control the conversation. And if you don't control the conversation, who knows which way that dialogue is going to end. But I can guarantee you it's going to be very difficult to get to the outcome what your desired outcome ultimately if you do not know how to control a conversation. And last, and the impact of poor questions is, you'll fail to convert the qualified buyers. So it takes very often a lot of hard work to have conversations with people. If you're making cold calls, it can take 100 dials or 100 calls before you actually have a dialogue with somebody. So it's really important that you're armed with the right techniques and the right questioning skills to be able to convert those buyers who actually are a good fit for you. But if you don't have those techniques and skills, then what you will do is you'll do all that hard work. You'll actually find the right potential buyers, but you won't convert them because you're just not ready and you don't have that ability to do so. All right, so qualification. Overall, the impact of poor qualification. Again, 4 points what I'll go through here. The first one is if you're not good at qualification, you're going to qualify way too many weak opportunities. And that some people think that sounds good when you have a lot of opportunities, but if you have a ton of opportunities and they're not well qualified, it's really going to have a bad impact in the long run. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, you're going to have a lot of meetings, but very few conversions. So you might be able to get people on the phone, you might be able to reach the right people, but you won't be able to convert them to either obviously sell to them or get them to commit to that next meeting. Number three, you're going to waste a lot of time chasing buyers because ultimately what you're doing is wasting a lot of time chasing unqualified buyers. So if you don't qualify correctly, then you'll just be chasing people all the time who don't want to speak to you again because ultimately they don't have the budget or they're just not a good fit for your solution. So we want to avoid that as much as possible because again, it's just wasted time, wasted energy. And last, your pipelines will never live up to expectations. And in particular, if you're a salesperson, your manager will hate you if you've got a pipeline which is just full of unqualified crap. And it's going to be a real pain for you to try and manage. And again, as well, if you're trying to raise funding for your business or you're just trying to, get your business off the ground, if you've got what you think is a big, fat, juicy-looking stack of opportunities in your pipeline, then of course they don't convert into anything, then again, it's going to be sort of very demoralizing, which kind of leads me on to my next point. Despite those sort of 8 points what I just made there, for me, the biggest impact of poor qualification and poor questioning is the impact what it has on your morale. Because I've seen so many salespeople work their guts out to try and book a lot of meetings, to try and have a lot of conversations, doing tons of emails, hundreds of cold calls, driving in the meetings, building strong pipelines, and then it all turns into absolutely nothing. And it is the most demoralizing thing you can do in sales. And the worst thing as well is the fact that it just burns so much of your time, it's very difficult to try and recover from. So this is the core reason why I would really want to help you avoid wasting your time speaking to unqualified buyers, chasing people who are just time wasters and they don't qualify anyway. That's what we're going to focus on today. And this is one of the core reasons why we're going to do so. Right, now we're going to move on to my 10 golden rules of effective questioning. I'm just going to skim through these, give you a few bullets, and I'll refer back to a few of these as well as we move throughout today's course. The first one is assume nothing. And I'll give you a bit of context for each one of these points rather than just obviously give you a title. This probably doesn't tell you that much. So when I say assume nothing, what I mean is avoid the mistake of walking into a conversation. Of course, a lot of people will do a lot of preparation before they have a conversation with somebody. So if you're having a meeting or a phone call with somebody, you'll do some preparation, find out some information about their business, maybe their team and how many people work there, maybe some technologies, what they're using. And all of that is useful information. But what you want to avoid is walking into the conversation, assuming all that information, number one, is correct. But also, information is good, but it's good when it's used at the right time and in the right way. So sometimes you can leverage a piece of information halfway through a call. And it's a lot more powerful than just bringing it up at the beginning of a conversation. Yeah, so what I want you to do is just assume nothing, because it can also make you look very silly when you walk into a conversation assuming somebody's, for example, using a piece of technology, and then you open your call with that fact and it turns out to be wrong. It's a really bad start to a conversation. So I always like to just guide you on just making sure you're walking in armed with information, but not assuming any of that information is completely accurate. It's better to sort of qualify and ask questions to confirm what you think you know. The next one, and again, we will cover and go back to this one later in the course, is always start with an open question. Yeah, I'll talk about what an open question is for those of you who don't know later on as we move in. But ultimately, it's a question what you ask, which will not end in a yes or a no answer. Yeah, because we want at the beginning of a conversation, we want to start a conversation flowing, but we want that conversation to ultimately come from the buyer. So always start with an open question. Rule number 2. Rule number 3, ask one question at a time. It's a very common habit for people. You might do this yourself already, but not actually notice you do it. But people very often layer questions on top of each other, and it comes often because of insecurity. Yeah, so you'll ask maybe a good open question, but then you'll also maybe just layer another one on top of it because you're a little bit nervous and you have a couple of questions in mind. So you might be tempted to ask more. And the problem with that is if you ask 2 or 3 questions kind of at once, you're only going to get the answer to one of them. Yeah, and then what happens is typically then people don't really want to ask the same question again twice. So they kind of skip those questions and move on and ask something different. So again, just be aware of that. Be conscious that you're not doing it already, and just try and stick to one question at a time. Number 4, again, this is kind of makes complete sense when I say it. You're like, let the buyer answer. Well, yeah, of course. But so many people, what they do is, again, it's another habit. People are they're very insecure and they dislike silence a lot in a conversation. So a lot of salespeople who I've worked with in the past, especially people who are like, founders who are not used to doing sales, who don't class themselves as salespeople, then when they try to do sales, what they'll do is they'll ask a good open question when they learn how to do that. And then what they'll do is maybe ask 2 or 3. That's obviously what I just mentioned there in the last number 3. And then, but what they'll do is instead of letting the buyer answer, they'll suggest some answers. Yeah, so they'll ask a question and then say, oh, for example, it could be this, this, or this. Yeah. Now, that might get you the answer what you're looking for, but on a lot of occasions, number 1, it's really irritating when you sort of interrupt somebody when they're thinking about how to answer your question. But number 2 is like, if you give somebody like a couple of options of how to answer a question, you kind of convert an open question into like a closed question. So then you kind of get a one-word answer potentially. But at the same time, you might get an answer based on your suggestions, what wouldn't have been the answer the buyer would have given you if you would have given them time. So just be aware of that. When you ask your first question, just be quiet and just wait and pause. Don't be afraid of a couple of seconds silence and let the buyer answer without prompting them for some potential responses. Kind of down the lines of what I just said is golden rule number 5, shut up and listen. The first book I ever wrote was called Stop Talking, Start Selling, for this exact reason, because I think one of the biggest habits salespeople have is that they just do not shut up. They ask questions, but they're not really interested in the answer. They're not listening to it, and they carry on talking and talking and talking instead of just shutting up after they've asked a question and listening and digesting to what's been said. This is probably the biggest communication skill you can learn, and it is the most important when you work in sales and you want to get good at sales, and especially at this stage in the conversation where you're qualifying somebody. Shut up and listen a lot. And again, I will come back to this particular rule here throughout the course today. The next one, and again, this one seems like it's obvious, but a lot of people don't do it. Take notes. Now, I know there's a lot of technology around today what can record your calls, which is good. Yeah, it makes us a bit lazy. I do the same thing. I use technology and it records my calls and gives me a transcript afterwards. Therefore, I don't need to focus too much on scribbling 6 pages of notes throughout a conversation. But note taking, when you're scribbling down notes in a conversation, it can sort of help you relay really to the buyer who's answering your questions that you're actually listening to them. It's like active listening to show that you're taking notes. Sometimes what I do is, like, especially if I'm on like a video call, then I'll just let the buyer know. I say, hey, just so you know, I am listening to you, but if I'm not looking at you, it's because I'm just taking a few notes. Is that okay? Yeah. So the thing what I found with note taking is, and especially physical note taking, is it also helps me digest what's being said, and it helps me in a conversation. I write down prompts. So I'll write down a specific keyword. I'm not scribbling down every word and every sentence what's been said by the buyer. But if there's something specific what I know I'm going to use maybe as part of my next question, or what I might use later in the conversation, then I just write a quick sort of bullet point, a single word or keyword, and I put a circle around it, because then I know I'm going to go back to that. And there's something about when you write down physically, then it sinks in your brain, and it kind of prompts your brain as well to just remember to go back to that particular point. So there's a lot of value in taking notes. But of course, if you're not recording calls, then I think taking notes is absolutely crucial, because otherwise you're going to miss a ton of useful information, which you might not even use in that particular conversation. But if you do take somebody to a second call, third call, next meeting, that information could be super valuable. So if you don't write it down now and you don't record your calls, then of course, how are you going to remember that? So that was number 6. Number 7, save the pitch for the presentation. Too many salespeople just give everything away in the first conversation. Yeah. What they do is they suffer death by micro pitch. Yeah, so what you don't want is your buyer to look like this guy, yeah, on the other end of a phone call or a video call, or especially in a physical meeting. You don't want to be boring somebody to tears because all you're doing is blabbing and pitching your solution. That's not what this conversation is about when we're trying to qualify. Qualification is about you listening. It's not about you pitching. Yeah, so what you need to do is avoid micro pitching. And just so you understand what I mean when I talk about micro pitching, because it's a terminology I made up, then this is how a micro pitch conversation looks. So the seller asks a question, the seller receives an answer to that question, and then the seller does a little bit of a micro pitch based on the answer to that question. Then he asks another question, gets another answer, does another little micro pitch talking about another feature or part of their product or service, and then they do it again, and they do it again and again. You might be able to get away with doing this once or twice in a conversation, but if you do it more than twice, you are going to bore your buyer to tears, and they are not going to want to carry on this conversation. Yeah. And worst of all, like I said, save your pitch for the presentation. Yeah. Unless you're trying to close on this particular meeting, in this particular conversation, then you need to avoid giving everything away. You need to avoid pitching your solution. You might have a certain allocated slot in this conversation to be able to demonstrate and show slides or show your products or explain your services, but don't micro pitch it throughout the conversation. Have a conversation, qualify if a buyer has a need, and then figure out when and how you're going to deliver your presentation. Just do not do it in the middle of a back and forth dialogue of questions and answers. Number 8, I'm a stickler for this one. Skip the chit chat. I'm all for building rapport with buyers, okay? And people seem to think that you have to have 5 or 10 minutes of chit chat and rapport building at the beginning of a call in order for you to build trust and rapport. You build trust and rapport throughout a conversation, and you do that via questioning techniques most of the time. And those are what I'll share with you today. Just don't waste the time what you have with this buyer, which could be very limited. Don't waste a big portion of it talking about stuff what doesn't relate to your objective of the call. Yeah. Now, if you've got a meeting and you've invited 3 or 4 people, maybe to a video call, one of them shows up early, by all means, talk about the weather for a minute or two. Talk about something, do just general chit chat, right? That's okay. But when everybody's there and you've started, like, as much as possible, start that conversation so you can get to your objective and you're not going to run out of time. Okay, so skip the chit chat. Number 9, don't ignore the elephant. One of the worst mistakes you can make, and one which you'll get less respectful of the buyer is if there's an obvious problem or an obvious, it could be two things, right? There could be an obvious problem, what the buyer's facing, what's right in front of them, but they don't see it. Yeah, they can't hear it, they don't see it, they're not aware of it, but you are. That could be one scenario. Or the other thing could be if there's not a fit, right? So if this buyer clearly does not qualify, if you can't qualify that they have a need for buying your products or services, like that's a big elephant right there. And again, they might not see this. They might see it, but they might not. Either way, don't ignore the elephant. Take it on. Say what you want to say, especially if you're trying to sell to like senior stakeholders and decision makers. Like they just want you to cut to the chase. They want to know if you know something was wrong, just tell them and be direct with them. Yeah, if it's somebody else who's maybe not a direct decision maker, then of course you might want to deliver it in, not such a direct fashion. But the most important thing is just don't ignore the elephant, because the elephant is not going to go anywhere. So you need to really tackle that and take it on. All right, last but certainly not least, always ask, how does that sound after giving pricing? Yeah, and again, we'll talk through this a bit later in the course. But this is one of those things I just repeat again and again and again. When you give pricing, even if it's a pricing range, ask, how does that sound? And shut up. All right, let's jump into how to control conversations. Structure is how you control conversations. There's, of course, a lot more to it just than saying structure. But the structure is how you control conversations. That's the number one thing I will try and embed into you, is that you need to have a structure for your call. I always remember I had an old VP of sales, and he always used to use the terminology he used to say, follow the yellow brick road. Now, for those of you who don't know what this is, because maybe you're not as old as me, there was an old movie called The Wizard of Oz, and Dorothy, this young lady, she was trying to find her way to this big palace so she could make her way home to Kansas. And she was told to follow the yellow brick road. Now there's a lot of distractions on the way, like a forest, a spooky forest, and all sorts of other stuff. And as soon as she got distracted and walked off that road, it became impossible to get back onto it and find it again. And I think that's a really good sort of analogy of thinking about how to control your conversations, is you need to stay on this path. You do not want to get distracted in a conversation and try and go off this path. This is also why I talk about avoiding chit chat, because when you do that, you kind of lose your direction, and sometimes it's really difficult to get back on that path, which means, again, you're going to struggle to get to the objective of the conversation. So always try and remember, if it's useful for you, follow the yellow brick road. Probably go to YouTube as well, and you can see there's a little song there that will be embedded in your head if you play it a couple of times, and you'll never forget. All right, so structure. Like everything in life, the structure of a conversation has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of try and break down these conversations into a beginning, a middle, and an end for you, so we can understand sort of those three sections, if you like, of this structure, what we want to follow. And we'll start off with the beginning, and that's what I call your conversation objective. So it's really important to understand where we're starting from and ultimately where we want to get to. Yeah, and the first thing I'll say to you is, whenever you start to qualify somebody, always try and have a mindset of not qualifying somebody in, but qualifying them out. So you want to qualify your buyers out as much as possible, because the majority of people you speak to, especially if you've got a broad audience and you're not targeting sort of too niche, the majority of people you speak to will not qualify or will not have a need for your products or services. Yes, if you take this mindset to qualify out, and what you're going to do is be very selective about who you take on to that next conversation, who it is you spend most of your time with, and you're going to be very quick to point out and figure out who doesn't qualify and put them to one side and focus on the most important ones, which are worth your time and your money more. Okay, so always have this mindset. It's not a negative mindset. I would call it a skeptical mindset, but I would say that is kind of what you need to have by default when we talk about qualifying buyers. So your conversation objective. What you want to think of in your head is try and think to yourself, right, the goal of my conversation is to ensure that this buyer has a real need for my products or services, and I'm going to persuade them to, of course, that's going to be your outcome. Just to give you an idea here, I wrote a few examples of objectives or outcomes. You might have in a conversation, your conversation might be, the objective might be to send somebody an information package, get them to sign up to a newsletter or something, get them to attend a free discovery session, or get them to agree to another meeting. Or it might actually be to buy your products or services. You might have something where you've got short sales cycles and you're able to sort of close somebody in one call. Then of course that could also be an objective. Yeah, so always try and think about what your objective is before you get going, because then you kind of have this razor sharp focus on, right, here's what I want to aim for before you sort of even start that conversation. It's really important to have that frame of mind. And on that topic now, I'll move on to buyer qualification criteria. And the reason why I talk about this is because what we want to focus on is asking the must-ask questions. Because I've done this exercise before with people, and I've said to them, write down all the questions that you need to ask your buyer to know whether they are a good fit, whether they have a need for your products or services. And generally, on average, people usually write down between 10 and 15 questions. And 10 and 15 questions is a lot of questions. Sometimes you might only have enough time on a call to ask two. Yeah, 2 or 3. I think 2 or 3 questions, something like that, could be the typical example of a call, especially if you're cold calling, having a conversation with somebody just who you never spoke to before. So this is why I always talk about sort of buyer qualification criteria and understanding that, because this is part of the framework I'm going to give you here to be able to plan your conversations and plan the questions what you want to ask. And one of the core reasons is, like I said, if you're listing 10 to 15 questions and you're trying to get through all of those, it's going to make your calls and your conversations just sound like an interview and feel like an interview. And that's really bad for the person on the other end of it. Yeah. So if you're calling people or meeting with people and it's the first time you've ever met them and you're just trying to reel through a list of 10 to 15 questions, like, it's going to sound like an interview. They're not going to want to be in that conversation very long. Yeah, so that's what we want to try and avoid as much as possible. We don't want our qualification conversations to sound like an interview. So here's what I always say to prepare 2 or 3 primary questions that will uncover if a buyer has a need. That might sound a little bit daunting. You might think just 2 or 3, but I have a lot more things. I understand that that's the case. I'm not saying that you can fully qualify a buyer in 2 or 3 questions, but you can cover some of the core fundamentals you need to uncover in 2 or 3 questions. So now what we're going to do is I want you to pause the video. I want you to go grab a pen and a piece of paper. Maybe I think we've done around about half an hour now, so it might be good to also pause the video, go grab a drink, a cup of coffee, whatever your cocktail is, and then pop back, because then we're going to jump in and do a little exercise here which helps us prepare. Okay, so the exercise. What I want you to do is, again, you've just come back. I want you to pause the video and I want you to write down the top 3 reasons why a potential buyer would not qualify for your solution. Yeah, and this is a preparation in your mindset for the questions what you want to ask. So remember here, I'm asking you not to write down the questions, but what I want you to do is write down the top 3 reasons why somebody would not qualify as a potential buyer for your products or services. Yeah, so once you've done that, what I want you to do is send me an email. You can email your answers to me at dcw@davidcraigwhite.com. Maybe pop obviously a relevant subject line in that email, so I've got a bit of context as to which exercise you're writing to me, because there are more than one today. And here's just a few examples just to prompt you as well. So examples for why people might not qualify could be they've got an incompatible industry, incompatible technology what they're using, maybe they don't have the resources, company size is too big, too small, they might have no real motive or real needs, wrong timing and budget could also be one, but I would probably focus on some of those like first few there, which seem to be the most common for most scenarios. Okay, so like I said, pause the video, write down top 3 reasons why a potential buyer would not qualify for your solution, and then drop me the answers on email, and then we can jump back in. Okay, so strategic questioning techniques. Now we're going to get to the real juicy part of this course. This is going to be rather intensive, so it's a good job you just had a little drink and a little break while you did the exercise, because what we're going to dig into here, so I'm going to take you through some begin with. I'm going to take you through some really basic questioning techniques, some basic types of questions, but then I'm going to help and layer that into some more complicated, complex sort of questioning techniques, which you'll need to practice a little bit. But you'll also realize when we do this that they're not so complicated once you understand how to use them. It's just a case of repetition and practice, and you'll pick them up pretty quickly. So let's jump in. Now, most people don't realize that I think most salespeople, if you've been in sales for a while or you've read a couple of books or blog posts or whatever, then people generally know about open questions and closed questions. Not everybody, but quite a lot of people. But very few people know how many questioning types there is. And I've wrote down a few here. I'm not going to cover all these today. Don't panic. We definitely don't have enough time to cover all of these. But I will be covering a few for you. I've not written down every single questioning technique there is here or type of question. There are many more than this. But this is just to give you an idea of the toolbox, what you can develop as you work on your sales skills and start to add these different skills and techniques into your toolbox, because there's a lot to learn, and if you can learn some of these, then it will take you to another level compared to most average sellers who don't really invest their time. Okay. As I mentioned before, I said to prepare 2 or 3 primary questions that will help you uncover if a buyer has a need. Now, what you should have in mind when doing this is the answers you just sent to that little exercise, what we did. So when you're thinking about the reasons why somebody would not qualify as a buyer, now I want you to use that and think about, okay, what question would I ask, or what questions would I ask, essentially to find out if they actually have this problem or not. So that's the mindset, and that's why I just did that short exercise before we jump into this. When we go into this level of the conversation, this stage of the conversation, I always like to make you think of when you and a buyer are in a room together, or on a phone together, or on a Zoom meeting, whatever it may be. When you're the seller, it's like being in an interrogation room. The spotlight is on your face. And your job is to get that spotlight and turn it around and put it on the buyer as quickly as possible, because you want to take the pressure off you having to talk all the time. And how you do that is by using questions. I'll just revert back to golden rule number 2 here. Always start with open questions. And that's what we're going to talk about here, because that's how we're going to shift that spotlight over to the buyer very quickly in our conversations. So what is an open question? I answered this before, but I'll just give you a bit more context. So open questions are questions that encourage a detailed response, and they avoid sort of a yes or a no. Now, first of all, that's super important, because if the first question you ask to a potential buyer is a yes or no question, like a closed question, then it's going to almost kill your conversation very quickly, and that spotlight flips back onto you very quickly, and you need to think, what's the next question I'm going to answer right now? So it really has a big impact on the beginning part of your conversations. You'll find open questions, most of them will start with a what, a how, a when, or a who. There's also why questions. I'm not putting those here, and I'll explain to you why a little bit later. And they're really great conversation starters when you use these ones. Okay, here's a couple of examples for you. I've just laid 3 random examples here of open questions, what different salespeople selling different products could actually start a conversation with. First one, you could ask, hey, what are you currently doing to ensure your business stays compliant with GDPR? So if you're selling something related to GDPR solutions, that's a good open question to start a conversation with. If you're selling business insurance policies, you could start a conversation by asking, hey, when was the last time you reviewed your business insurance policy? Or if you're selling something related to sales teams, training or whatever, how often do you train your sales team? Yeah, so those are three just really basic, simple examples of open questions, what you could use to start a conversation. What you've got to be careful with, and this is the question I was talking about before, this is why I say not to start with a why question, is because you've got to be careful not to be too intrusive with your first couple of questions. So again, remember that we've not built any rapport or trust with the buyer as of yet. And if this is the first conversation and they've just picked up their phone or agreed to a quick call with us, if you start a conversation with a why question, it comes across a little bit intrusive. So what you want to do is avoid using that as your first sort of 2 or 3 questions. Try and avoid why questions and save those for a bit later on. Right, next exercise. Again, we're going to grab your pen and paper, pause the video in a second. So now I want you to write down those 3 open questions. Yeah, these are the 3 open questions you're going to use to start a conversation, to sell your product or services. Yeah, and these are the ones you're going to ask to find out if you feel like there's a good need here. So remember, we're trying to qualify out, yeah, not qualify in. So you need to be asking good open questions here, which tell you straight away if this buyer qualifies in or out. Yeah, and again, email the answers to me, subject line, or you can just reply on the string. If you did email the other exercise to me already, just reply on the same email and throw down these 3 open questions. Here's an example. So if I'm calling companies trying to sell sales coaching or trying to sell my sales courses, here's 3 open questions I could ask. And what I want you to notice here is these aren't 3 random questions. They're not 3 different questions. What I try and do is you want to try and layer your questions. Yeah, so your first question should kind of lead into the second and lead into the third in a sort of streamlined way, what makes sense. Yeah, so I could start by asking somebody, hey, who's responsible for training your sales team at the moment? Yeah, because one of the key sort of objections I might come across is if there's an in-house trainer or coach already, or if there's a sales leader who is doing all the training and coaching and doesn't want anybody external to come in and train his team. Yeah, so I want to find that out pretty quickly. And this first question here, the answer to that will hopefully give me some insight whether that's going to be a problem, because then I know straight away that's an objection, that's a blocker, then I don't need to spend any more time on this particular call. If it goes well, then the next question I might ask is, hey, how often do you manage time to run those sessions? Yeah, so somebody's already doing, for example, if they're already doing training or coaching for their team, I want to ask, okay, how often are you managing to do that? Because maybe they should be doing it more often. Maybe they're not doing it barely at all, or maybe they're doing it a lot. Yeah, again, this lets me know how much time this person is investing in this, whether it's actually scalable for them or not. And then the next one, again, I would look at this question and think, I can find out how many people are in the sales team. I can go to LinkedIn and find out how many salespeople are in a sales team roughly. But again, I don't want, even if I have that information, I'm going to follow golden rule number 1. I'm not going to assume it's correct, because it might not be. I might be missing some people who are not on LinkedIn or just not shown on LinkedIn. But at the same time I also want to use this information because I want the buyer to tell me this number, especially if I'm going to use that as part of my questioning strategy. Okay, so those are 3 layered questions. Typically what I would feel totally comfortable having is my top 3 questions. If I was to do a cold call to somebody today to try and sell them sales training or sales coaching. So now I want you to pause the video. I want you to write down the 3 open questions you would use to qualify if a potential buyer has a need for your products or services. So pause the video, email the answers over to me again, and come back shortly. Okay, so now we're done with the exercise. I will start by just talking about this statement here. And this is something what you'll hear a lot of people tell you. I think if you go on LinkedIn or you go on Google or you speak to any sales guru or trainer, they always tell you just ask a lot of open questions and don't use closed questions. Closed questions are bad for sales, they'll tell you. Just ask a lot of questions. Here, download this PDF guide with 25 open questions to qualify your buyers. Again, not much use if it's going to sound like an interview. Not much use if we're not using a strategy in our questioning techniques. So I do it differently. I will tell you to use open questions in the beginning in your first question. Yeah, but then what I will do is I will show you how to layer closed questions in with your open questions. So a closed question is a question that prompts a short response, right? So it prompts a yes or a no or a specific A or B answer. Yeah. And they work really well if you mix them with your open questions, because what you do is you use them to paraphrase and you use them to clarify answers, what your buyer gives you. And paraphrasing, just so you know, it's repeating back what the buyers have said, but in your own words. Yeah, and it helps build rapport because it demonstrates active listening, helps you clarify facts, and it also helps you get those small agreements and yeses, which ultimately lead to the end yes, which is hopefully obviously getting the sale or getting the next meeting, whatever your objective, sorry. So paraphrasing, it's necessary sometimes more than other times. Yeah, so depending on your buyer, you might have a buyer who's very talkative and there might be a very simple answer to the question you're asking, but they give you a really long-winded answer. And that's when paraphrasing would be super useful. So here's just an example for you. Going back to that GDPR question I could ask earlier on. So if I say to somebody, hey, what are you currently doing to ensure your business stays compliant with GDPR? We might have somebody who answers very straightforward and there's like, we have a plugin on our website. And then I'm going to use a closed question, which is the okay, this one down here. I'm going to use a closed question on the back of that. So I asked an open question, I received the answer, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of paraphrase back what's been said, just with a slight different angle on it, because I want to get that final yes. What I want you to understand here is when I repeat this back, then I want you to highlight and put massive emphasis on your tone, the speed of tone, and the words you're using when you paraphrase. Okay, so if somebody says we have a plugin on our website, my tonality when I respond to this is going to be like, okay, so you're relying on a plugin to keep you compliant? Yeah, so my tonality there is going to suggest this is a bad idea. Yeah, that doesn't sound very normal. Yeah, and again, what I would do is I would apply silence here. Yeah, silence is golden. So when I've done this paraphrasing and I've used this closed-ended question, I'm going to be very quiet after they've answered. After they've confirmed yes, then I'm going to be very quiet for a couple of seconds, because what you want is for that answer, what they gave, to sink in. Yeah, because this might be that realization moment they have in the conversation where they're like, Yeah, so if your closed question there prompts a little bit of doubt in their brain, they're going to answer by default, be like, yeah, that's right. Okay. And we have a couple of seconds, sorry, not minutes. Then it would be very awkward. We want a couple of seconds of awkwardness almost. Yeah, and this is what you need to get comfortable with in sales, especially if you want to get good at questioning. You need to get good at applying silence at different stages of your conversations. Now we get to that why question. So now we've asked a few different questions. We go back and forth between an open question, paraphrasing with a closed question, back and forth, back and forth. And then once we've sort of built up a bit of rapport, after asking a few questions, having a bit of a conversation, then it might get to that stage where you can now ask a why question. I always like to try, so they don't sound abrupt and they still don't sound intrusive, then I always try and break a why question up. So I've used an example here on this slide. So I hope you don't mind me asking, but why? Yes, I hope you don't mind me asking, but why are you only using a plugin for your GDPR compliance? Yeah, and again, tonality. Yeah, so I'm lightening up the way I ask this question, and I'm obviously adding a bit of context into it and asking it in a particular way, just to ensure that the buyer doesn't seem like they're on the back foot and it doesn't seem like an aggressive question. Okay, so why? Use it at specific time in the conversation where you feel comfortable doing so, where you feel like the rapport is there and it's ready to be executed. That's when I would use the why question. And remember, the why question is a very powerful stage in the conversation. It can really transition the conversation to the next level. So now we're ready to move on to that next level, which is the middle of the structure. Yeah, how to control your conversations in the middle of the structure. I'm going to take you through some more questioning techniques here. These are a bit more, I say advanced, but they're not that advanced, right? I think it's just a case of getting used to them and understanding when to use them. Most questioning techniques are actually fairly simple, but it's just a case of understanding when to use them. That's the trick, because you can use a questioning technique at a completely wrong time and the impact will be totally different than if you use it at the right time. So that's where the practice comes in, getting comfortable with it. So at this stage in the conversation, once I've found a problem out, once I've got a bit of a sense as to why somebody's doing that, and I can sense maybe, they feel like it's the right thing, or maybe they've got a bit of doubt in their head, then I might want to layer in a scale of 1 to 10 question. Yeah, and this is a technique used to measure the extent of a challenge. It's really good for determining factors like time, cost, how difficult something is for a buyer, how big the challenge is. And I've put a few examples here as well of the different types of scale of 1 to 10 questions you can focus on. You can focus on a scale of importance. So you can say to somebody on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being very important and 1 being not at all, how important is it for you to be GDPR compliant, for example, if we stick to that particular example? Yeah. And if you just remember what I just said here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to gauge like how important is something for somebody, or how difficult is it, whatever it may be. Yeah, so if they answer this question and they say a 2 or a 3, again, this is about qualifying needs. If somebody, if you're selling GDPR technology and you've got a buyer on the phone who seems to be a good fit, you've asked them a few questions, it seems like, okay, there could be a good fit here. They're using a plugin for their website, which they shouldn't be using. It's not a great solution. I have a better one. But when you go and ask them this scale of 1 to 10 question and say, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is GDPR compliance for you? And they might be like, well, actually, we have a US headquarters, so it's not really that important. It's like maybe a 2 I would give it. Yeah. Then I know at this point in the conversation, should I be pushing this any further? Should I take the conversation further, or should we just call it a day now and say thanks? Yeah, so it's really good for highlighting how important or how much of a problem something is. Next one, scale of time. Yeah, so on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being way too much and 1 being like not much at all, how much time are you using on this right now? Yeah, so you can use this and apply this to sort of all sorts of products and services. If you try and tailor this and focus it around yours, if one of the values you're offering is save time, this is a great question to use. The 1 to 10 scale of time question. And the next one, scale of pain. Yeah, let's get a feel here of how much of a challenge, how painful this is right now. Yeah, so on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being massive and 1 being very small, how much of a challenge is this for you right now? Yeah, if you can get this question asked and answered, then this really, really tells you whether you've got a potential good buyer or not. Yeah, if somebody gives you a sort of higher than 5 answer here, we know we've got a good chance of taking this conversation a bit further and maybe getting a buyer. Yeah. So they're just a few examples of the scale of 1 to 10. Use it wisely. And I've got just a word of caution for you here as well, is when I say use it wisely, I would say use it at the right time. And I would also say don't use it more than once or twice in every conversation. Yeah. Now, I would say a very small amount of buyers will pick up on questioning techniques or selling techniques. But if you're using these very specific types of questioning techniques, especially like the 1 to 10, if you use it more than once, then it becomes like, okay, he's using the same question more than once. If you try and use it more than twice, they're going to get very sick and tired of it, and it's becoming a bit cliche already in just one conversation. So try and always avoid using the same technique more than once or twice per conversation. Next questioning technique, the tie-down question. Yeah, the tie-down it's used to get those small agreements. So a little bit like a closed question. You can use a tie-down question is kind of a closed question. Yeah, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get these small agreements from a buyer on a specific point. So you're trying to get them to agree with you on a specific point or statement. Yeah. So like I said, it's essentially a closed question, which is added to the beginning or end of a statement. I've got some examples for you here. not statements, but some examples of a tie down. So a tie down is when you use something like isn't it, doesn't it, won't you, don't you, shouldn't you. All those different things there, those are tie downs. Now they're quite easy to layer on and add at the end of a statement, what you make. I would say putting them at the beginning of a statement is a bit more of an advanced technique. So I would say if you're just gonna try these out, try and just use the easy ones and try and just maybe test one of them and use the tie down at the end of a statement rather than trying to do it at the beginning. So you could, here's just a few examples for you. You could be like, that's a lot of time, isn't it? Yeah, and they're like, yes, that's what we wanted to say, of course, because we're just getting that agreement between us, mutual agreement. You know, your time would be much better spent helping your team, wouldn't it? Somebody agrees to that, great, I know it. They're on my path, let's take it to the next level. You should be reviewing your policy once per year, shouldn't you? Yeah, so those are all just very simple tie-down questions, what you can use in a conversation, again, just to get those minor agreements throughout the conversation. Here's one where I would use it at the beginning of a statement. Now you'll understand why I say it's a little more different and advanced. Is you could say, it makes sense, doesn't it, that you use a solution which provides more coverage? Yeah, so you can see there that that's a little more difficult to do. Still works really well, but requires a bit of practice. So definitely I would start with the ones where you're putting the tie down on the end of the questions you're using. So that was tie downs. Now we're going to talk about impact questions. Impact questions are my favorites, by the way. So impact question is an open question. And what they do is they get the buyer to think about the broader implications of something. Yeah, so sometimes you need to really highlight for a buyer the impacts of what's going on. Yeah, because they don't see it for themselves always. So we ask impact questions essentially to try and highlight impact of whatever we're talking about. And you can go down to a personal level on impacts. I usually say most conversations start off by talking about something on a company level or a team level, yeah, departmental levels when you're talking about specific challenges. But if you get comfortable with it, a lot of people are not comfortable with this. That's why they don't like doing it. You can also get down to a personal level with somebody. And I'll kind of show you how to do that as well and talk about how to do that without being super cheesy. So you would ask, for example, just a layer of questions, like you would ask somebody, so what's the impact this is having at the moment? By default, people will generally either answer at a company level or departmental level. If they do, then you can say, how's that impacting the team at the moment then? Yeah, if they answer that, great. And then you could ask, how about you personally? Yeah, now it's gonna, depending on what you're selling and how complicated it is and what types of companies you're selling to, you might not get to the personal level, and it's totally okay. But what I would say, if you do have the opportunity to do that, especially if you're selling in a competitive market, especially if you're selling a fairly complicated product to bigger businesses where there's a lot of hierarchy and stuff, like get down to that personal level where possible. It's not, people find it really cheesy, that's why they feel uncomfortable doing it. But if you get down to the personal level for this buyer, and you know this person is somebody who can pull the strings and maybe make the decision, if you get down to the personal level of impact of what it's having on that person, you are having a total different conversation with them than any other salesperson out there. Okay, so don't underestimate this. Don't feel uncomfortable that you want to do it. You might not want to do this in the beginning, but if you can do it, impact questions, super powerful. Okay, and again, what we would do is paraphrase back what we've heard. If we do get, of course, down to any level of personalization, you can say, okay, so it's causing people in your team to leave, team level, and you're being stuck with the extra work. Yeah, so just that is also an example there of getting down to a personal level without it sounding cheesy. Yeah, so I'm not looking for people to admit that they're going home crying at night. I'm looking for them to admit that this is having a personal impact on them somehow, which every problem generally is. And you probably hear a lot that empathy is very important in sales, and it is. And it's at this particular point, if you do get down to a personal level, then just remember to just step back a second, use some silence again, and just be like, I'm sorry to hear that. It must be pretty difficult. Yeah, and just be quiet and let it sink in. Because again, what we're doing here is we're letting the impact level here sink into the buyer, because they might never have thought about what you're talking about right now. Yeah, they might have been just talking about the surface issues for a while and they know they exist, but they've never really thought about what impact it's having on their team or them individually. So we want to let that sink in at this point in the conversation. And now we're going to move on to how to control the end of the conversations. Yeah, so now we've started a conversation with some good open and closed-ended questions. We've really broken into the problem and finding out and isolating, does this person have a need? It seems like they have a need. We use impact questions to find out, okay, how much of a need and who's this impacting? Yeah, so we're now starting to get an idea of the scope of the problem. And now, of course, we're going to move on to the last part of the conversation. And that's where we're going to dig into a couple of closing techniques. Okay, so once you feel like you've got a buyer who's ready, then you might want to just test them with a test close. Yeah, so you don't want to jump in and try and get commitment without first feeling sure or a bit more sure that you'll be able to get acceptance on that commitment, because you might cause the rapport what you've built sort of to be pushed back a little bit if you try and move too early. So that's what we use a test close for. Yep. So it's used to sense whether your buyer is ready to move forward to a solution or not. And it's going to help you understand their level of interest and readiness to take that next step before you go and ask. And it's super simple. Yeah. So if you get somebody who's just admitted to the impact of a problem, and you just say to them, are you still open to finding a solution to this? Or are you open to finding a solution to this? It's a very light question. Again, you silence at the end of it. But it's a super powerful question. And again, the question what really, really indicates whether a buyer is ready or not. So that's a very simple test close. You could add a bit more contexture to it as well. So you could also say, so if I can show you a way to help you solve this problem, is that something you're open to taking a look at? Yeah, so two variants in how to use a test question, a test close, in order to sense whether the buyer's ready to move or not. And as I said, silence is golden. Shut up after asking your questions. Then we've got the alternate choice close. So if you do get a positive response from the test close, I would move straight to this. Yeah, so somebody says, yes, I'm open to a solution. I'm going to use the alternate choice close. And this is as it sounds. Yeah, so what you're doing is you're using a closed question used to guide the buyer towards a commitment by offering two clear options, both of which lead to your desired outcome. Yeah, so two options, both are positive for you. That's what the alternate close is. Yeah, so that's great to hear. Great to hear you're ready to sort of take a look at the solution. Would it work better for you if I come later this week, or would next week be better for you? Alternatively, hey, I can come by on Monday. Would the morning or afternoon work best? Yeah, so two options I'm giving. I'm not giving an option out. I'm just giving an option in or in, just two options for when we're going to have that next meeting and that next conversation, whenever that may be. Yeah, so again, like I said, these are kind of advanced in a way that you need to know when to use them and how to use them, but you can see these are not complicated questions. Yeah, this is a very good technique, but it's also a very simple technique. And I would say this one as well is very easy to sort of practice and learn and pick up on, and you'll become super natural at using the alternate close question. It's a super easy technique to pick up on and use, so don't be afraid of trying this one for sure. Then we're going to move on to upfront objections. Okay, so once I've got commitment, what I'm going to do is continue to qualify. Yeah, now this might seem, so far we've got this far now, we've got commitment. This might seem like overkill for some of you. And if you're not selling big complex products and you don't have a ton of meetings and things, you might not need to do all of this in the beginning. This might be something you do on the second meeting, second conversation. So don't think you have to do all this at once. I'm just trying to give you as much value as possible and help you. If you are in this situation where you do want to really qualify hard in that first conversation, then I would definitely continue and use some more qualification questions, even after you've got commitment for when that next conversation is going to happen. So upfront objections. These are used to raise concerns, what buyers usually have. So you'll have probably, I don't know, 2 or 3 common objections, what always turn up at some point in your sales process. And what you want to do is you want to try and raise those yourself. So if the buyer doesn't already raise them, if you can raise those objections before the buyer, that's going to give you a lot of power, and it's also going to have a reverse psychology effect as well, which really works well. Yeah. So it's good for qualifying buyers out, especially if those objections are like the brick walls, which you can't get past. So, and here's how you might frame that. You could say, so just before we put that next meeting in the calendar, one of the reasons this might not work out, and I want to flag this now with you, is the cost. Our solution typically costs between sort of $2,000 and $15,000 per year for a company of your size. Yeah, so you're raising the objection of cost if that's a common one. You want to let them know in this call, because there's no point. If they don't have the budget, if they fall off their chair when you give them this, then of course, we don't want to have a next meeting. There's no point if there's not going to be any budget there. And then, of course, I'm going to remind you of golden rule number 10. After giving pricing, what do? We ask, how does that sound? And then we shut up and we let it sink in. The reason why I really, really highlight this particular golden rule, and I talk about shutting up here, is because when you give pricing to somebody, people generally, they don't really admit that they don't have the budget. They don't like to admit they don't have the budget. So they'll sort of string you along. So what you got to be careful of and be very aware of is the tonality being used. Yeah, so the tonality used in the conversation when they answer your question, you got to be very sort of have sensory awareness of how they answer, because they can use the same words, but they can mean two completely different things. Yeah, so I won't go into too much detail with it, but if you ask somebody, how does that sound? And you kind of get a long pause, that's generally not a good sign. Yeah, if you get a quick response and be like, yeah, that seems reasonable, then that's good. That doesn't sound like they're lying. But if you get a slight delay, or you get like a, but so you've got to really pay attention to the response you're getting and the tone and the speed, rather than just focusing on the words, because the words can be the same, but they can mean two completely different things, which is why I really focus on that. Okay, almost there. Next, process questions. Now, process questions are simple, open questions, and they're used to uncover specifics of a process. That's how I use them a lot. Yeah, so I use these process questions to avoid asking the cliche questions most salespeople ask. So when they ask about decision-making processes and stakeholders and procurement steps and timelines, they always ask these really sort of awkward-sounding salesy questions like, "Who's the decision maker?" and when will you be making the decision by, and things like that. And it just comes across really salesy, and at the end of a call can really sort of ruin rapport. So what I do is I use process questions. It's really simple, really easy, and it can really soften the questions what we want to ask about these difficult topics. So decision process. I will ask, so assuming you like what I show you, sort of what's the internal process for getting approval on something like this? Yeah, when you ask this question, you might get a detailed answer. You might get somebody telling you about everything and everyone and all the stakeholders. You might not. So sometimes you need to use one or more questions, process questions than others, but you just need to be prepared for that. Procurement, financial or legal. So if they don't, in the first question, so when you ask about decisions and you ask about sort of how the process looks, if they don't mention legal or finance, and that's something you usually go through, ask it. Yeah, and just say, what about sort of finance and legal process? What did they look like? Yeah, so again, I'm just talking about using the word process in there, then it's not salesy. Just asking about what the process looks like. Stakeholders, and who else, apart from yourself, because you're really important, who else will we need to get involved in that process? Yeah, this is in particularly very good when you're setting up a next meeting, because what you want to try and do, of course, is bring more people in, especially if you know there's multiple stakeholders to be sold to. Then we want to find out now who's going to be involved in this process. And again, this could be where you get people telling you about the legal or the finance team, or it might just be their manager or colleagues, whatever it may be. And timelines. Yeah, and how long do these processes typically take? Yeah, so rather than asking, when do you think you can make a decision, which is a really bad question, instead you ask, how long do these processes typically take? Yeah, because now I've got a timeline. I know who's involved, I know what the process is going to look like, and I'm going to get an idea now about how long they typically take. So if procurement is going to take 6 weeks, well, then I know I'm definitely not going to be getting a decision before 6 weeks in most scenarios. So this gives me a really good insight as to where I'm up to. I've got a fully qualified buyer. Yeah, so that's it. Once we get here, I think if you ask all these questions, I'll be very impressed if you ask these, especially if you start straight away. Like I said earlier on, I don't expect that to be the case. It's going to be a case of learning these things. But once you get to this stage, then you've got a very well qualified buyer. And you can honestly say, we understand your needs, and I feel like we've got a solution for you. Okay, so just a quick recap of our course objectives. So I said at the beginning that by the end of this course, you'll be able to confidently qualify which buyers have a real need for your solution, helping you eliminate those time wasters and build stronger pipelines. And I really hope, after all these slides and all these questioning and qualifying techniques and strategies, I really hope that you feel like we've achieved this objective. I don't expect, like I said, that you're going to be able to go and apply these. In fact, what I would say is the best way of trying to apply these techniques is, I always say, to try and take 2 of the things we've learned today. Take 2 of the questioning techniques, for example. Try 2 of the simple ones and just try layering those in your next conversation. Because it's repetition what equals mastery. Yeah, but if you try and learn everything together and try and apply all these, we've probably been through like 15 different techniques or something today, your brain will just be on overdrive and you'll lose track of your conversation. And that's the last thing we want. So really try and focus on isolating just a couple of the techniques we've learned today. Try and apply those to your calls. Repetition a few times, maybe try them for a couple of days. Make sure you're using them on every call. And then when you feel comfortable with them, that's when you can maybe go get another one and add that in there. I wouldn't add 2 at a time. I would start with 2 and then just add 1 at a time as you get comfortable with using each one, and just practice those as you go through. So that was the end of the course. I wanted to let you know as well that I am now starting to offer certifications. So if you're interested in getting certified and getting a certificate for this course, please drop me an email. Again, just reply to the emails you sent me earlier on. Let me know, hey David, I'm really interested in getting certified for this course. And of course, we can take that offline and we'll get a certificate created for you and sent out, which you can share on your LinkedIn profile and print out and put it on your wall if you like. Same with any questions. Got any questions? I always love to get your questions and love to get your feedback on the back of these courses. Drop them to me on email. I will always try and get back to you, especially if you've got this far and dedicated over an hour in taking this course. Then I will dedicate time to respond and reply and give you some feedback, first of all on the exercises you've sent, but also on any questions you've got on the back. So I guess that's all for today. Thank you again for investing your time in this course, and hopefully I'll see you again in another course, or maybe in my LinkedIn feed, or definitely in my inbox. Bye for now.